Hello, everybody. Before we begin, let us introduce ourselves briefly. I am Angelia Theresia, and
I'm Disca Ariesti.
And I'm Pratiwi Firza.
so today we are going to be talking about language learning and teaching. We'll begin by explaining what is language.
Teaching. Language. What is language? A definition of language might vary from one to another since it depends on their own. The lexicographer's understanding of the context. Language, according to the Merriam-Webster Collegiate Dictionary, is a system means of communicating ideas or feelings by the use of conventionalities, signs, sounds, gesture, or mark having understood meanings. While in Stephen Pinker's book, The Language Instinct, language is a complex, special skill which develop in the child competently without conscious effort of or formal instruction is deployed without awareness of its underlying logic. In qualitatively, the same is very individual and in distinct from more general abilities to process information to be or behave intelligently. And the Consist Columbia Encyclopedia language is a systematic communication by vocal symbol. In addition, H. Douglas Brown stated in his book Principle of Language Learning and Teaching that there are a number of possible definitions of language as follows. First, language is systematic. Second, language is a set of abilitary symbols. Third, those symbols are primarily vocal but may also be visual. Fourth, the symbols have conventionalities, meaning to which they refer. Five, language is used to communication. Six, language operates in a speech community or culture. Seven, language is essential human, although possibly not limited to humans. And the last, language is acquired by all people in much the same way. Language and language learning both have universal characteristics. Okay, the next, learning and teaching. A definition of learning relief in temporary dictionaries is that it is acquiring or getting of knowledge of a subject or a skill by study, experience, or instruction. On the other hand, Slavin, an education psychologist, define learning as a change in an individual caused by experience. And a definition of teaching is implied in the first definition of learning, which might be outlined as showing or helping someone to learn how to do something, giving instruction, guiding in the to do something, providing with knowledge, causing to know or understand. More definition of learning are being broken down according to principles of language learning and teaching by H. Douglas Brown as follows. 1. Learning is acquisition or getting. 2. Learning is retention of information or skill. 3. Retention implies storage, system, memory, cognitive organization. 4. Learning involves active, conscious focus on and acting upon even outside or inside the organism. 5. Learning is relatively permanent but subject to forgetting. 6. Learning is involved some form of practice, perhaps reinforced practice. And the last, learning is a change in behavior. However, intent cannot be defined apart from learning. Teaching is leading and facilitating learning, enabling the learner to learn, approaching the condition for learning, teacher philosophy of education, their teaching style, their approach, their method, and classroom technique will be determined by their understanding of how the learner learns. Okay, the next, science of learning. Richard, Richard E. Myers conveyed three requests he focused on in his book, Applying the Science of Learning. They are: one, how people learn; two, how to help someone learn; and last, how to determine what people know. In this book, Meyer also teaches readers how to apply the science of learning to understanding the reciprocal relationship between in which educators are giving instruction to the learned. Later, by the instruction given, the student will be learning. And finally, the educator needs to find out what learning took place by assessing it.
And next is language learning theories. In the following slides will be shown to you 6 theories of language learning that has been put forward over at least 5 decades. 1. Behaviorist. B.F. Skinner, a behavioral psychologist, agreed with Locke, built his theory of behaviorism on his concept and behavioral psychology. His language learning theory states that all behavior is in response to surrounding stimuli, and he later applied this to language learning through something operant conditioning. As stated in Principles of Language Learning and Teaching by H. Douglas Brown, operant conditioning refers to conditioning in which the organism, in this case, a human being, emits a response or operand, a sentence or utterance, without necessarily observable stimuli. That operand is maintained or learned by reinforcement, for example, a positive verbal or non-verbal response from another person. A child says, "want milk," and a parent gives the child some milk. The operand is reinforced, and over repeated instant is conditioning. Before the development of operant conditioning by Skinner, there is a theory of behaviorism that can be illustrated as follows. So the illustration called Pavlov's dog, it started in the late 1890 when Ivan Pavlov, a Russian psychologist, identified a fundamental associative learning process in called classical conditioning that marked the beginning of behaviorism. It refers to the learning that occurs when a neutral stimulus begins to be connected with a stimulus that produces a certain behavior. He came across this phenomenon unintentionally while studying digestion in dogs. He noticed that the dogs started salivating while looking at the helpers who brought their food. He later went on to experiment with food and several other stimuli of smell and sounds to study this phenomenon. The dogs had made a connection between the sound of a bell and receiving food, so a new behavior had been conditioned. Second, universal grammar. Noam Chomsky pleads against many of Skinner's theory of behaviorism with his own theory of universal grammar. He He declared the existence of innate properties of language to explain the child's mastery of a second language in such a short time, despite the highly abstract nature of the rules of language. The innate knowledge was embodied in a metaphorical little black box in the brain, a language acquisition device, or LAD. McNeil described the LAD as consisting of 4 innate linguistic properties: the ability to distinguish speech sounds from other sounds in the environment, the ability to organize linguistic data into various classes that can later be refined, knowledge that only a certain kind of linguistic system is possible and that other kinds are not. And the last is the ability to engage in constant evaluation of the developing linguistic system so as to construct the simplest possible system out of the evolvable linguistic input. Thus, universal grammar is a child language that focuses on what has come to be known. For example, a baby has the ability to hear and make any sounds from any language up until a certain point in development. They are language learning machines. And third, there is Crescent's monitor. Stephen Crescent summarized a set of 5 hypotheses in his book, The Monitor Model, in 1970s and until 1980s as listed below. The acquisition learning, the monitor, the input, and the effective filter, and the natural order. So in the acquisition learning section, it is the most fundamental of the 5 hypotheses in Crescent theory and the most widely known among linguistic and language teachers. According to Crescent, there are 2 independent systems of foreign language performance: the acquired system and the learned system. The acquired system or acquisition is the product of a subconscious process very similar to the process children undergo when they acquire their first language. It requires meaningful interaction in the target language, natural communication, in which speakers are concentrated not in the form of their utterance, but in the communicative act. The learning system or learning is the product of formal instruction, and it comprises a conscious process which results in conscious knowledge about the language. For example, knowledge of grammar rules. A deductive approach in a teacher-centered setting produces learning, while an inductive approach in a student-centered setting leads to acquisition. According to Crescent, learning is less important than acquisition. The monitor hypothesis explains the relationship between acquisition and learning, and it also defines the influence of the latter on the former. The monitoring function is the practical result of the learned grammar. According to Crescent, the acquisition system is the utterance initiator, while the learning system performs the role of the monitor or the editor. The monitor acts in a planning, editing, and correcting function when 3 specific conditions are met. First, the second language learner has sufficient time at their disposal. Second, they focus on form or think about correctness. And third, they know the rule. It appears that the role of conscious learning is somewhat limited in second language performance. According to Crescent, the role of the monitor is minor, being used by being used only to correct deviation from normal speech and to give speech more polished appearance. Crescent also suggests that there is individual variation among language learners with regard to monitor use. He distinguished those learners that use the monitor all the time, or called overuser, and those learners who have not learned or who prefer not to use their conscious knowledge, called as underusers. An evaluation of the person's psychology profile can help to determine to what group they belong. Usually, extroverts are underuser, while introverts and perfectionists are overuser. Lack of self-confidence is frequently related to the overuse of the monitor. The input. The input hypothesis is Crescent's attempt to explain how the learner acquires a second language and how second language acquisition takes place. The input hypothesis is only concerned with acquisition, not learning. According to this hypothesis, the learner improves and progresses along the natural order when they receive second language input that is one step beyond their current stage of linguistic competence. For example, if a learner is at a stage I, then acquisition takes place when they are exposed to comprehensible input that belongs to level I plus E, I plus 1. Since not all of the learners can be at the same level of linguistic competence at the same time, Crescent suggests that natural communicative input is the key to designing a syllabus, ensuring in this way that each learner will receive some I plus 1 input that is appropriate for their current stage of linguistic competence. The effective filter hypothesis embodies Crescent's view that a number of effective variables play a facilitative but non-causal role in second language acquisition. These variables include motivation, self-confidence, anxiety, and personal traits. Crescent claims that learners with high motivation, self-confidence, a good self-image, a low level of anxiety, and extroversion are better equipped for success in second language acquisition. Low motivation, low self-esteem, anxiety, introversion, and inhibition can raise the effective filter and form a mental block that prevents comprehensible input from being used for acquisition. In other words, when the filter is up, it impedes language acquisition. On the other hand, positive effect is necessary but not sufficient on its own for acquisition to take place. Finally, the last important natural order hypothesis is based on research finding by Dooley and Bird, Fatman, Makino, which is cited in Crescent book, which suggests that the acquisition of grammatical structure follows a natural order which is predictable. For a given language, some grammatical structure tend to be acquired early while others lag. This order seems to be independent of the learner's age and one background, conditions of exposure, and although the agreement between individual acquirers was not always 100% in the studies, there were statistically significant similarities that reinforced the existence of a natural order of language acquisition. However, Crescent points out that the implication of the natural order hypothesis is not that a language program syllabus should be based on the order found in the studies. In fact, he rejects grammatical sequencing when the goal is language acquisition. 4. Fourth, there is cognitive. Jean Piaget, a Swiss psychologist, put learning of a language within the context of a child's mental or cognitive development. He argued that a child must understand a concept before they can obtain the specific language form which expresses that concept. Seriation is a good example of this. When a child can assimilate objects with respect to size, then there will be a point in their intellectual development. It means that if you give the child a number of sticks, they are able to arrange them in order of size. Piaget alluded that a child who had not yet reached this stage would not be able to learn and use comparative adjectives like bigger or smaller.
Conversation. Conversation theory is based on Gordon Parks' interest in cybernetics. Cybernetics refers to the theoretical study of control processes in electronic, mechanical, and biological systems. It comes from the Greek word meaning tradesman. It can also be defined as the science of communication and control in the animal and the machine, or the communication within an observer and between the observer and his environment. The theory developed by Parks, conversation theory, originated from the word cybernetic framework and attempts to elucidate learning in both living organisms and machines. The fundamental idea of the theory was that learning occurs through the conversation about a subject matter which serves to make knowledge explicit. Conversation can be educated at a number of different levels. 1. Natural language, general discussion. 2. Object language for discussing the subject matters. 3. Meta language for talking about learning or language. In order to facilitate learning, Parks argued that the subject matter should be depicted in the form of structure which show what is to learn. These structures exist in a variety of different levels depending upon the extent of the relationships displayed. The critical method of learning based on conversation theory is teach-back, in which one person teach another what they have learned. Parks identified two different types of learning strategies, serialist and holist. For students to learn a subject matters, they have to learn the relationships among the concepts. On the other hand, for educators, the explicit explanation of the subject matter facilitates student understanding. Nevertheless, students vary in their preferred manner of learning. Schumann's acculturation. John Schumann particularly observes how immigrants learn a new language when they relocate to his acculturation model. The acculturation model studies the sociological and psychological impact of the relocation on language learning. In spite of thinking about language learning in terms of learning for pleasure, he examined it when it was necessity. Migrant workers, and their children learn a new language with far more pressure from social and psychological areas. Consequently, this pressure resulted in the success of the following. Cultural identification, he argues, is vital to the individual, and if an immigrant's language was roughly equal socially to the language of their new home, they were more likely to learn the language. The same was true if the culture were similar. Oh, um, 8 different factors, point of a Schumann, influence how immigrants assess just how closely their culture connects with another. As the following: attitude factor, cohesiveness, cultural congruence, enclosure, integration patterns, intended lack of resistance, size factor, social dominance. He points out further the importance of attitude, culture shock, and motivation for influencing the psychological aspects of language learning. His theories were vastly different than previous language learning models since he looked at the individual person and not humanity as a whole. Lanjut, Kar. Udah. Okay, thank you. And I think it's enough. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.